Here are 3 superpowers that I learned from an Olympian, a billionaire, and my dad that I've used over the last 13 years to build a $100 million business. Now, the first that I want to talk about, I came across when I was coaching rock climbing. I was working with this little girl. She was 12 years old. And so I would have been, maybe 22, 23 years old. And this little girl, she was this fearless rock climber. She had this natural innate ability, very intuitive understanding of how to move on the rock. And she was fantastic from a very early age. But she struggled with heights, which, as you can imagine, for a rock climber, that's a bit of a struggle, right? If you're not good at heights, you're going to have a hard time climbing to the top of the industry. Haha, pun. And she wasn't unique in this. Like, a lot of the kids that we would work with, was interesting is when they're young, they're not super fearful of heights, but as they get older, they start to understand the risks associated with what they're doing. And this, I think, is why adults become more conservative in older age, as they start to see all the risks and the downside. They have more to lose. And so kids, they get more fearful as they get older. And what we would talk about a lot with these kids is the idea of fear on the wall and how to approach that, because it's very easy and natural when you're watching somebody on the side of a cliff and they're climbing. It's very natural to yell out to them, "Oh, don't be afraid, just go for it," right? Don't be afraid, just do it. You can do this, and try to encourage them through this by telling them what we called coaching the negative, telling them what not to do. Don't be afraid. But that's not an action you can take. And more so, you can't just tell somebody to rationally stop being afraid and then they overcome their emotional reaction to the moment. What you can do, though, is coach the positive. And it's not that we don't want you to be afraid. It's that we don't want the fear of action to incapacitate you from taking the actions necessary. And so the positive that we would coach is be brave. This is a moment to be brave. When you feel that fear, be brave, go for it. And now that person on the side of the wall, when they hear be brave, they go, I will be brave. And they will face that fear and they will go for it, right? Now, the best climbers that I know, it's not that they're not afraid. It's just they have the most bravery. They're the most able to move in spite of the fear or the self-doubt and the anxiety that they're feeling. Another way of putting this, and this is the first thing that I learned, was the idea of poise. Poise is how you overcome the emotional reactions that you have at a biological level to act in spite of how you're feeling, and to do so in a way that has grace. When this little girl was on the wall, one of the things that she was amazing at is as I knew she was afraid, but nobody else could tell, because she looked so cool, calm, and collected on the wall. And what happens is our psychology often follows our biology. And if you can move through the traumatic moments of life with calm, with poise, with certainty that you can find the answer, then the universe has a way of kind of rearranging itself around your expectation. This is why so many people believe Roger Federer was the greatest tennis player of all time. It's not because he didn't win the most awards. Novak Djokovic did. But Roger brought this certain ephemeral quality to his tennis that you can only describe as gracefulness, as poise. His ability to, in those moments under extreme duress, extreme anxiety, those extreme pressure moments, he looked like he was the master of the universe, that he was fully in control. And you never had a doubt that he was going to prevail in those moments. So that was the first thing that I learned, was poise. Now, that little girl, she ended up going on and becoming an Olympian in rock climbing. And the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, the very first time climbing was ever featured, she was one of 2 U.S. women that was featured there. And more so than any other woman I've ever worked with or any other climber, she had poise for days. So that's the first thing I learned. The second thing is I learned this from a guy who I was very good friends with. I still am, actually. He's a business partner, but we don't talk as much as we used to. But back in the early days when we were rock climbing, I did not know that he came from a very wealthy family. In fact, one of the wealthiest families in the United States. In fact, when people would ask him what he does for a living, he would tell them that he just sells door-to-door vacuums. And people believed him. He's just a really dry, really private, secretive type of person. And it wasn't until many, many years later that I realized, oh man, that guy is actually a billionaire. Like, he's just flying completely under the radar, had no clue. And he was a really good friend at this point. So I was like, that's surprising. Now, the thing that I learned from him is that this idea of stealth wealth, that you don't need, if you have the resources and you have the money, you have all these things, it can be very hard to create relationships, meaningful relationships with people, and know what their true intents are for that relationship. A lot of times, the people that knew where he had come from and his family's wealth were always just trying to get close to him to use that. They were always coming to him with business ideas or looking for investments. And you could always see the people, you could tell really quickly who knew who he was versus who didn't know who he was, and how they treated him and how they approached him, how they deferred to him, how they asked for things. And truly, I think the reason him and I had such a good relationship is because for so long I had no idea who he was. And by the time I did, it didn't matter because I'd already formulated an idea. He was my friend. I had this other identity for him. And so we could approach each other on a completely different level than what most people were approaching him. And I mention this because I noticed the same thing occur for me on social media now. Depending on how somebody knows me or where they first interact with me will dictate how they engage with me. So for instance, if somebody sees me on YouTube or LinkedIn and they realize I have a pretty sizable audience on those platforms, they treat me very differently than if they first meet me, say, on Instagram, where we are still growing and we have maybe 10,000 followers. When they see me on Instagram, they go, oh, he's just starting off, he doesn't know anything. And so they treat me very differently. And I can tell very quickly when the light bulb switches for people, if they did a Google search, if they did a little research and they come back and all of a sudden they're like much more engaged in the conversation than they were before. Before it was like trying to create a relationship, trying to say hi and connect, and it's like pulling teeth. And then all of a sudden out of nowhere, they lean back in like, oh, now they're very interested. And I share this because it's natural human tendency that this occurs. But I think if you want to be successful in business, the best mindset that you can have is not to go into relationships with people asking, what can I get out of this? And instead to go into every relationship with the janitor, with the front desk person, with the person running the company, with the same mindset that they have something to teach you, that you could learn from them, and that you have no idea how much wealth somebody is hiding in stealth mode. And if that's the barometer that you're using to dictate whether or not that person is worth networking with or trying to go deeper in a relationship with, you're going to be sorely disappointed, because some of the most successful people that I know in life, they have extreme stealth wealth. You would just never know it unless you took the time to talk to them and get to know them and understand and genuinely want to connect with them as a person. So that's the second idea that I learned, and that was from a billionaire. The third idea, this one is from my dad, and it's the idea, well, this one I learned when I was 16 years old. I had been pen pals with this girl that I met on Runner's World Forum. So back in the day, I was a cross-country runner. I was very, very into cross-country, and this was early 2000s, so there wasn't a lot of like social media platforms back then. So back then, we hung out on forums. That's how we met people. So I met this girl. She lived 6 hours away. I was in Minneapolis. She lived in Wisconsin. And we became very good pen pals, good friends. And we would use AOL, Instant Messenger, and we would connect every day after school. So like we're kind of like, virtually dating, whatever. And she had this winter dance in like January. And she's like, do you want to go to this dance with me? And I was like, boy, howdy do I? I'm a 16-year-old boy. That sounds like the best thing in the world. Couple problems with this, though, is that she lived very far away and I didn't really have a car and I really didn't have any money. Well, I tell my dad this and he's like, cool, why don't you and your sister, you guys can drive out there. I'll give you a little bit of money. You guys go make a weekend of it. All you have to do is take your sister with you and one of her friends. I was like, okay, that's easy enough. Now, the day that we leave on this trip, we have this hellacious snowstorm in Minnesota. We wake up at like 5 a.m. and it has blizzarded. When we slide off the road 3 times before even getting out of the city, going slow. So like this is going to be a really long, slow, tedious task. But I'm persistent because I'm a boy that wants to go see a girl. Well, we get 4 hours outside of the Twin Cities, so about halfway point between her and where I live. And I'm sleeping in the backseat of the car so I can get as much beauty sleep as I can get. Because again, I'm a 16-year-old boy. I need all I can get. And I wake up as we come around a curve on the freeway going 75 miles an hour. We hit a patch of ice and we start sliding. And so I wake up in the back seat. I look out the back door of this Honda Civic hatchback, very tiny car. And I see where we are sliding off the road going Mach 20 is a Ford Taurus that has slid off the road exactly where we're about to go. And we slam into the back of that car, inches away from where my head was on the side of our car. We crack open like an egg, and we flatten their trunk all the way up to their back seats. And it's just carnage. Now, thankfully, nobody was hurt, because it turns out that Ford Taurus wasn't the car that slid off the road. There was actually a car in front of them that slid off the road. The Ford Taurus pulled over to help the people out of the ditch. So no good deed ever goes unpunished. Now, here's the point, is we all go to the hospital because I have a mild concussion and things are a little wonky, a little weird. We get to the hospital. My sister calls my dad. He makes the drive out. 4 hours later, him and my stepmom, they arrive at the hospital. And I'm still there, kind of like in a mildly concussed state, but still a 16-year-old boy, very motivated to go see a girl. And my dad could have very easily shut it down and been like, "Nah, dude, we're going home. You just demolished the car. You have a concussion. Like, we're going home." But he didn't do that. He instead said, if you want to make this happen, it's simply a matter of figuring out how to make it happen. So he said, let's look at what you have for resources. And I was like, I got $100. And he's like, cool, let's get a phone book. And let's find out if there's a bus, if there's a limo service, because often they charge by the hour. Maybe there's a taxi service that'll take you the remaining 2 to 3 hours. Maybe there's a puddle hopping plane that you could hop on, like a crop duster, and maybe they'll fly you there for super cheap. So he gives me this phone book and he says, good luck. And before I'd even found a solution, he took my sister and went home. And he left me at this hospital with no solution in sight. He just had the faith that I would find a solution with my $100 in my concussed state. Well, this nurse overheard my plight. And she goes, well, if you can wait a couple hours until I get off my shift, I'll drive you there. And I was like, perfect. And so a couple hours later, she gets off and she drives me the rest of the way. And I make it in time for the dance. Huzzah, it was beautiful and glorious. And then to get back from Wisconsin to Minnesota, I rode a train. It was my first time on a train and it was amazing. Long story short, the skill my dad taught me that day was the skill of resourcefulness. That if you want to make something happen, it's simply a matter of finding the solution, that there is a solution if you're willing to look for it. And the fact that he didn't sit there and hold my hand to find it, but that he had enough confidence and belief that circumstances, I would rise to the circumstance and find the solution, and he just left, has been the ultimate lesson that served me well throughout life. No matter which moments we've been in, I always look back on that and I go, my dad had the faith and the confidence that I could find the solution. So I borrow that belief in myself as well. And so that's the third skill that I learned. That's poise, stealth wealth, and resourcefulness. This is a little bit longer of a podcast, a little bit more story-based. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you like this format, let me know. Put it in the comments below, and we'll catch you guys in the next episode.